Widowed rancher searched for milk for his newborn, until the neighbor girl knocked a full breath of wind was a living thing that night, howling to the cottonwoods, clawing at the eaves of the cabin like some starving coyote desperate to get in. Snow swept sideways across the valley, blanketing everything in white silence, except for one sound that refused to die, the thin, hungry wail of a newborn. Elias Boone stood in the middle of the one-room cabin, his boots planted on rough plank boards, his hat still on though the fire had nearly gone to embers. He looked down at the small bundle in his arms, his jaw locked tight enough to crack a tooth. The baby's face was red as a winter apple, her mouth open wide in soundless desperation now that her cry had given out. Her mother lay still on the bed behind him, hair tangled, face pale as the sheets. The lantern light made her look waxen, almost peaceful, as though she'd fallen asleep with a secret she meant to keep forever. The clock on the mantel ticked once, then stopped. Outside, the wind filled the space it left. Elias's throat burned when he tried to swallow. He'd held rifles, reins, and ropes his whole life. Never something as small and helpless as this. The baby's breath fluttered against his wrist like a trapped bird's. He whispered her name once. Anna. The baby stirred, whimpered. He shifted her gently, trying to remember the way Martha used to cradle their firstborn boy before the fever took him. That had been 3 winters back. Now both lay gone, and this one, this little scrap of life, was slipping the same way if he didn't do something. He knelt beside the bed. "Martha," he murmured, though he knew she couldn't answer. "You gotta tell me what to do. She's hungry. She needs milk, and I can't—" His words broke apart in the middle. The baby began crying again, thin and tired, as though scolding him for his uselessness. Elias set his jaw, tucked the blanket tighter around her, and moved to the door. The snow came in sideways when he opened it, cold biting through his shirt like knives. He grabbed his coat, hat, and saddlebag, tucked the baby inside his coat, and stepped out into the storm. The horse stood in the lean-to, coated in white, steam rising from its nostrils. Elias threw the saddle over, cinched it tight, and mounted, cradling the bundle against his chest. "Easy, boy. Town 6 miles. We can make it." The wind roared back at him, and the horse lurched into the storm. The world disappeared in white. Snow filled his beard, his eyelashes, the hollow of his collar. The baby whimpered, then went quiet again, and that silence frightened him more than the wolves that sometimes howled on the ridge. He rode with his head bent low, eyes on the faint outline of the next hill, guiding the horse by instinct more than sight. When the faint glow of town lights appeared through the storm, he almost wept. The first place he stopped was Doc Hensley's house. The windows were dark, shutters latched. Elias banged on the door with the side of his fist until the skin split. No answer. He tried again, harder. Nothing. He cursed under his breath, looked down at the bundle inside his coat. "Hold on, little one." He turned toward the trading post next. The sign creaked overhead, half buried in snow. Inside, barrels were stacked, the smell of grain and cold tobacco thick in the air. No one there either. He took what he needed, a small tin of condensed milk, and left coins on the counter. But when he opened the tin by the light of his lantern outside, the milk was thick and spoiled. He flung it into the snow, cursed again, and rode on. The saloon's door was locked. The church's cross was buried in white. Everywhere he went was empty. The storm had swallowed the town whole. By the time he turned the horse back toward home, dawn was still hours off, and he could no longer feel his fingers. The baby made no sound at all. He pressed her against his chest and prayed. Not words exactly, but a rough, broken groan that came from somewhere deep in his ribs. Halfway home, the horse stumbled. Elias nearly went down with it. He caught himself gasping and realized tears had frozen to his cheeks. "Don't quit on me now," he rasped. The horse blew steam, steadied, and kept on. When they reached the cabin, he kicked the door open and stumbled inside, half blind from snow glare. The fire had gone to ashes. He laid the baby down on the table, struck a match, and coaxed the coals to life until the flame caught on the pine logs. The sudden light made him blink. He peeled off his gloves and reached for the tiny form on the table. She was too still. Her skin felt cold even through the blanket. "No," he whispered. He rubbed her cheek, her hands, her feet, anything to bring warmth back. "You hear me, Anna? You don't stop." He wrapped her tight against his chest again and sank to his knees by the fire. He remembered Martha's voice, soft, lilting, singing the lullaby their boy used to love. He tried to hum it now, but his throat cracked on the first note. The sound that came out wasn't a tune, just a raw noise full of fear and loss. The wind moaned outside, a mournful harmony. He didn't know how long he knelt there. The logs hissed. The flames threw red light over the cabin walls, and his breath came heavy and slow. He thought of the grave he still had to dig come morning, the one waiting just beyond the porch for his wife. He thought of the hole already in his heart, and how this child was all that was left of the woman who'd made him human again after years of fighting and loss. "Don't you go, too," he murmured into the firelight. He stayed there until exhaustion dragged him under. When he woke, the cabin was gray with dawn. The fire had burned low again, but the wind had gentled. He opened his eyes to silence and felt his gut twist. Then, faint and weak, came a small sound against his chest. A sigh, a tiny mew of life. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding and closed his eyes. "That's it, girl. That's it." He rose stiffly, fed more wood to the fire, and looked toward the bed. Martha's body lay where he'd left it, the sheet drawn up to her chin. The light through the window made her seem almost alive again. For a moment, he could imagine her eyes opening, her lips parting to tell him what to do. But she didn't. He stood over her a long while, then fetched his coat again. The ground would be hard, frozen near the stone, but he couldn't leave her there another day. He found his shovel by the barn, and under the pale sky, he began to dig. Each strike rang out across the valley, dull and final. The earth came up in clumps of frost. His breath smoked in the air. He worked until his arms trembled, until the first edge of sunlight caught the hills in faint gold. When the hole was deep enough, he went back inside and wrapped Martha in a sheet. He carried her out slowly, every step measured, careful not to jostle the bundle that still lay inside. He laid her in the ground and stood there, the shovel handle leaning against his shoulder. He spoke softly. "You were the only thing ever made me smile for no reason. I don't know what comes next, but I'll keep her safe. You can rest knowing that." He filled the grave, marked it with a wooden cross he cut months ago for a calf that never made it. The wind whispered through the trees, gentler now, almost kind. When he returned to the cabin, the baby stirred, whimpering again. Hunger. He looked around helplessly. The pot of broth from yesterday, the spoiled milk tin, the empty shelves. Nothing. He sat beside the fire, the child in his arms, and pressed his forehead to hers. "There's nothing left, Anna," he said. "Not a drop in this godforsaken place." The words scraped his throat like sandpaper. He hadn't prayed in years, not since the war, not since the fever took his boy. But now, with the snow still deep outside and the tiny body squirming weakly in his arms, he whispered, "If you're listening, Lord, I can lose everything else, but not her. Don't take her too." His eyes burned, and he bowed his head over her, rocking back and forth in rhythm with the wind. Then, just as the first pale light of morning broke fully over the hills, he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. 3 soft knocks on the door. He froze. No one should be out here, not in weather like this. He reached for his rifle from the corner, thumbed the hammer back. "Who's there?" His voice came out rough. A pause, then a woman's voice, trembling but steady. "It's Clara Mayfield, Mr. Boone, from down the valley." He frowned, lowered the rifle slightly, and unbarred the door. Snow blew in around her boots as she stepped onto the threshold. She was wrapped in a thin shawl, cheeks raw from cold, hair plastered wet against her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed, not from the wind, but from crying. "I heard about Martha," she said quietly. "Word reached us yesterday." Her gaze dropped to the bundle in his arms. "And the baby?" "She's hungry," Elias said. "I can't find milk anywhere." Clara stepped closer, her expression tightening with something like pain. I know. I buried mine 2 weeks ago." Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "He was born too early. Didn't live long." The air between them went still. Elias looked at her, saw the grief there, the same hollow ache he felt inside his own chest. He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." She nodded once, brushed a tear from her cheek, then took a deep breath. "Mr. Boone," she said, her voice trembling, "you don't have to be sorry. Maybe," she looked at the child again, then at him, "maybe I can help." He blinked. "How?" She hesitated, biting her lip, then spoke softly. "My milk, since the baby hasn't dried up yet. If you'll allow it, I can feed her, at least till she's strong." For a moment, Elias couldn't breathe. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the storm had quieted, the world wrapped in white silence. He looked from Clara's earnest face to the small, helpless child in his arms. His pride rose up first, his sense of what was proper, of what people might say. But then Anna whimpered, a weak little cry that sounded like the end of things. He met Clara's gaze. Her eyes were full of sorrow and something else. Mercy, maybe. "If this is sin," he murmured, voice rough, "then let God strike me later. Not her." Clara nodded once, slowly, and held out her arms. Elias hesitated only a moment before passing the baby over. The warmth of Clara's hands brushed his, gentle but steady. She settled by the fire, drew the blanket close, and soon the cabin filled with the smallest sound imaginable, the soft, steady suckle of a newborn finding life again. Elias turned away, his chest tight, staring into the flames. The light flickered over Martha's empty bed, over the rifle on the wall, over his rough hands trembling in his lap. The baby's cries quieted, replaced by the hush of contentment. Outside, the wind finally died. Inside, for the first time in days, there was peace. And though Elias Boone didn't yet know what this moment would mean, he understood one thing clear as daylight breaking over the snow. Salvation hadn't come from heaven. It had come from the knock at his door. The storm lingered 2 more days, a gray shroud over the valley that kept everything hushed and close. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, sealing the world away. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, and the sound of the baby suckling was the only rhythm that mattered. Elias Boone had not spoken much since that morning when Clara Mayfield appeared at his door. He kept busy, splitting kindling, mending tack, pretending not to watch her as she cradled the child near the hearth. He wasn't sure what troubled him more, the impropriety of it all or the quiet grace with which she carried herself, as though she'd been meant to walk into his life and disturb its ruin. He had lived with silence since the war, since Martha's gentle hands and laughter filled it for a time. Now this new voice, soft and unafraid, filled it again, but in a way that made him uneasy. On the 3rd morning, the wind, ease, and light came through the cracks in the shutters. Clara had fallen asleep in the rocker with Anna in her arms. Elias watched her from the table, elbows braced, coffee untouched. The sight stirred something deep, pity, admiration, fear. There was strength in the way she held the baby, but also grief, an emptiness he recognized. He rose quietly, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside. The air was brittle, every breath sharp enough to cut. The land stretched white and endless, a frozen ocean under a pale sky. He looked toward the little rise where Martha's grave sat beneath a new drift of snow. He'd done the work proper, but no cross or prayer could make it feel settled. When he came back inside, Claire was awake. She looked up, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "You didn't go far, I hope." "Just to see the lay of the land," he said. "Looks like the storm's done." "That's good," she murmured, looking down at the baby. "She's strong. Took to feeding right away." "You're lucky, Mr. Boone." He sat, rubbing his hands together near the fire. "Luck's not something I've been accused of lately." Clara smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Still, she's alive. That count for something." Elias nodded, then after a pause said, "You should rest a bit more. When the road clears, I'll see you home." Clara looked toward the window. "Home," she repeated softly. "Ain't much there for me now. My husband's buried on the other side of the ridge. His folks moved away last spring. Just me and an empty shack." He shifted in his chair. "I didn't mean to pry." "You didn't," she said, her voice steady now. "Loss is what it is. You can't scare me with talk of it. We're both living proof." The word sat between them, heavy as the silence after a gunshot. Later that day, he set about clearing the path to the barn. Clara stayed inside with the baby. And when he came back hours later, sweat freezing on his brow, he found the cabin warm and quiet. Clara had tidied the place, set a pot of stew on the fire, even mended the curtain by the window. She looked up when he entered, her hands folded in her lap. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I needed something to keep my hands from shaking." Elias hung up his coat. "You didn't have to do all that." "I know," she said, "but I wanted to. Feels good to work. Makes it hurt less." He nodded. "I know what you mean." They ate in near silence. The stew was simple: beans, salt pork, a hint of sage, but it was the first warm meal either of them had had in days. Elias watched the snow drift past the window while Clara fed the baby again, her face calm, her movements practiced. When she finished, she rocked the child until her tiny breasts grew even. Then she said quietly, "You'll need help for a while. The ranch, the baby. You can't do it alone." "I can manage," he said automatically. "Can you?" Her tone wasn't mocking, just honest. "You've lost a wife, Mr. Boone. You're raising a newborn in the dead of winter. You can't even ride to town without freezing half to death. Let someone help you." He met her gaze. There was no defiance in her eyes, only truth. He wanted to argue, to push back, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he gave a small nod. "For now," he said. "For now," she agreed. That night, while the wind moaned through the chimney, Elias sat by the fire, sharpening his knife. Clara hummed a tune he didn't recognize, soft, mournful. It filled the space between them like a memory neither dared to claim. He thought of Martha then, how she used to hum while cooking, and of how life had turned cruel in its habit of giving only to take away. He studied Clara's face in the firelight, the delicate line of her jaw, the faint bruise-colored circles beneath her eyes, and felt an ache that was both foreign and familiar. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Why'd you come here that night, Clara?" Roads were near impassable. She didn't look up from the baby. "I heard your horse through the storm. Figured something bad had happened. I was right." "You risked your life," he said. She gave a small shrug. Didn't feel like much of one to risk. He fell silent, ashamed of his earlier pride. There was a strength in her he hadn't seen in himself since before the war. By the next morning, the sky had cleared. Elias saddled his horse and rode down to check the cattle, leaving Clara to tend the fire. The world glittered with frost, every sound sharp and clean. But when he reached the creek line, he saw something that set his nerves on edge: boot prints. Fresh ones, leading toward his barn. He followed them, rifle in hand. The prints stopped near the door, and inside he found signs of trespass: a half-empty feed sack, a whiskey bottle, a lantern left burning low. Whoever had been there wasn't gone long. He doused the light, checked the corners, then stepped outside to scan the ridge. A flicker of movement caught his eye. 3 men on horseback, dark shapes against the snow, riding slow and watching him. He felt that old chill again, the kind that had nothing to do with the cold. These weren't drifters looking for shelter. The nearest outlaw trail cut close to this valley, and men had been known to take what they wanted from empty homesteads. Elias turned his horse, riding back fast. When the cabin came into view, smoke rising steady from the chimney, his gut clenched. He reined in hard, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but he could feel the eyes on him. Inside, Clara looked up, startled by his abrupt entrance. "What is it?" "Men out by the ridge," he said. 3 of 'em. Don't know what they want yet." Her face went pale. She rose, clutching the baby close. "Should we go?" "Nowhere to go," he said grimly, checking his rifle. "If they mean trouble, it'll come here first." He moved to the window, watching the horizon. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the snow. For hours, there was nothing but stillness. Then, as twilight deepened, a horse whinnied outside. Elias opened the door a crack. 3 riders sat at the edge of the yard, their coats dusted white, faces half hidden by scarves. One raised a hand in mock greeting. "Evening, friend," the man called. "Storm done left us dry and hungry." Thought maybe you had a bit to spare. Elias stepped out, rifle at his side. Ain't got enough for myself. You'd best move on. The man laughed, a dry, rasping sound. That so? Shame. We was hoping for hospitality. The other two dismounted, spreading out slightly. Elias's grip tightened. Don't test me, he warned. The leader tilted his head. You alone here? Elias didn't answer. The silence stretched. Then one of the men took a step forward, hand near his pistol. Elias raised his rifle and fired once. The shot cracked to the cold air, echoing off the hills. The man fell back into the snow with a cry. The others ducked behind their horses, returning fire. Bullets punched splinters from the doorframe as Elias dove inside. Clara screamed, clutching the baby, and dropped behind the table. Elias crouched near the window, reloaded fast. Stay down, he shouted. Another bullet shattered a jar on the shelf. He fired twice more, saw one man's hat fly off, the other's horse rear and bolt. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the shooting stopped. Silence. Only the crackle of fire and the baby's frightened cries. Elias waited, heart pounding, then edged the window. The yard was empty. Snow drifted down in slow, lazy flakes. The men were gone, one still body left behind near the fence. He lowered the rifle, breathing hard. They're gone, he said. Clara rose slowly, trembling. The baby was still crying. She pressed her face into the child's hair, whispering soothing words that even she didn't believe. Elias stared at his shaking hands. Didn't want no trouble, he muttered. But trouble always finds its way. That night, they didn't speak much. He buried the dead man out by the barn, said no words over him. The cold was enough. When he came back inside, Clara had laid the baby down to sleep. She was sitting near the fire, staring into the flames. You did what you had to, she said quietly. Elias sat across from her. A man shouldn't have to keep killing to stay alive. That's the frontier, she replied. Takes and takes till you forget what giving feels like. He looked at her, really looked at the tired lines around her mouth, the scars no one could see. You talk like someone twice your age, he said. She gave a small, weary smile. Grief will do that. The baby stirred in her cradle, a soft sigh in the silence. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You should go soon. It's not safe here. Where would I go? He didn't answer. He had no answer. Outside, the moon rose over the snowfields, silvering the world. Inside, the fire burned low. Clara reached out, laid a hand over his. Her touch was light, hesitant. You don't have to carry it all alone, she said. He looked down at their joined hands, then back at the fire. I don't know any other way. Then maybe it's time you learn. For the first time in weeks, Elias felt something ease inside him. Not peace, not yet, but the memory of it. The wind outside softened to a whisper, like a hymn carried on the cold. They sat that way for a long time, two souls bound by loss, neither speaking of what might come next. The baby's breathing steadied. The fire threw a warm glow over their faces, and beyond the cabin walls the wilderness held its breath. When Elias finally stood to check the door, he looked back at Clara. She met his gaze without flinching. There was no shame there, no pity, only understanding. He nodded once, and she gave a small smile. As he turned down the lantern, the night closed in around them, heavy but no longer cruel. For the first time since the storm began, Elias Boone did not feel entirely alone. Under the deep wash of night, a storm rolled over the plains like a slow-moving beast. Thunder cracked against the canyon walls, echoing through the valley where the Carter ranch sat half broken and half alive. Inside, lantern light flickered against the timber walls, casting long shadows that danced over the cradle where baby Eli slept. Luke Carter sat nearby, head in his hands, his revolver resting on the table beside a Bible he hadn't opened in months. The ranch still bore the scars of winter, of loss, and of what came after. Maggie had been there through it all, steady, strong, though she had every reason not to be. The girl who once came to his door trembling with nerves now moved about his kitchen like she'd been born to the place. The storm outside couldn't drown out the sound of her voice, as she hummed softly while rocking the baby. The melody was the same one Luke's late wife, Hannah, used to sing. It tore something deep inside him every time he heard it, and yet he couldn't bring himself to ask her to stop. "Wind's picking up," she said, glancing toward the window where the shutters clattered. Luke nodded, slow. "It'll pass. Storms always do." She smiled faintly, though her eyes lingered on him. Some take longer than others. He looked up at that. The air between them was thick with something that hadn't been there before, something neither dared name. For months, Maggie had been the thread holding what was left of his life together. She'd milked the cow when he couldn't, fed the baby when there was no other way, mended fences, and stood beside him when the weight of grief threatened to break him. And somewhere between the chores and the quiet nights, the line between gratitude and longing had begun to blur. The thunder cracked again, closer this time, rattling the windows. Luke rose and went to secure the barn door. Maggie followed him out, pulling her shawl tight as rain began to fall in hard, slanted sheets. They fought the wind to latch the doors, their hands brushing, rough, cold, and lingering for a second longer than necessary. When they turned back toward the house, lightning flared across the sky, throwing their faces into stark relief. "You should go inside," he said, his voice rough in the wind. "So should you," she countered, defiance in her eyes. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then the baby's cry broke the moment. Maggie ran ahead, skirts soaked, hair clinging to her face. Luke followed, breath heavy with more than rain. Inside, she lifted Eli and held him close, whispering softly. The child quieted almost instantly, his small fingers gripping at her dress. Luke stood in the doorway, watching, a man divided between past and present. Hannah's memory still lingered like smoke in the rafters, but Maggie's presence was something else entirely, solid, alive, undeniable. "Storm's tearing up the north fence," he said quietly. "You can't go out there in this," she protested. "Cattle scatter if I don't." "Then I'm coming with you." He almost laughed, almost. "You think I'm letting you chase cattle in a thunderstorm?" "I think you don't have much choice," she said, already pulling on her boots. And she didn't wait for his answer. She just went out into the dark, her lantern swinging in the wind. He cursed under his breath and followed. The rain hit like bullets. They fought through the mud, the sound of frightened cattle echoing through the valley. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the herd pressed against a broken fence. Luke shouted, cracking his whip, driving them back toward safety. Maggie moved alongside him, fearless, her skirts heavy with water. Together, they mended what they could in the howling dark. Then, above the roar of thunder, came another sound, a sharp report that froze Luke where he stood. A gunshot. He spun, drawing his revolver in a single, instinctive motion. Maggie ducked behind a fallen post, clutching the lantern. The light flickered wildly as shadows moved along the ridge. Outlaws. Luke had seen the signs days ago. Tracks near the water trough. Missing supplies from the barn. He'd hoped it was nothing. He was wrong. "Maggie, stay down," he barked, leveling his gun toward the ridge. Another shot rang out, splintering the fence post inches from his head. He fired back, the flash lighting up the rain like fire. The gunfight was quick and brutal. Mud splashed, bullets cracked through the storm, and every flash of lightning showed the figures closing in. Luke's jaw tightened. He'd fought in worse storms, in darker wars, but never with so much to lose. He moved to flank them, signaling Maggie to keep low. She didn't listen. She never did. When one of the men broke from cover, she swung the lantern with all her strength, catching him square in the face. The flame burst, and the man went down screaming as the lantern shattered. Luke took the opening, firing twice. Silence followed, broken only by the rain. When it was over, he found her kneeling beside the dying light, breathing hard. "You all right?" She nodded shakily. "I think so." He helped her up, his hand gripping hers. "You're reckless as hell, you know that?" Her voice trembled. "You have died if I hadn't been." He wanted to argue, but she was right. By dawn, the storm had passed. The world was washed clean, though the cost hung heavy in the air. 2 bodies lay at the edge of the property, men Luke didn't recognize. Their horses had fled into the hills. He'd have to bury them, same as any other man. Maggie stood by, holding the baby wrapped in a blanket, her face pale and drawn. "Was it them?" she asked quietly. "The ones who took your horses last month?" "Could be," he said. "Could be just desperate men. The West's full of both." She nodded, eyes distant. "It's getting worse out here. Folks say there's no law past the ridge anymore." "There's never been law out here," he said. "Just men trying to make their own." He turned toward the sunrise. The light caught on the wet grass, painting the land gold and silver. It should have felt like peace. It didn't. Inside, after the chores were done, Maggie poured him coffee. Neither spoke much. The baby gurgled softly in his cradle, the only sound between them. Luke felt the pull again, stronger now, harder to ignore. She'd saved his life, his ranch, his child. What was left of him that wasn't already hers? She looked up suddenly. "Luke," she said softly, "you can't keep fighting ghosts." He met her eyes. "And what else is there to fight?" "You got a son who needs you," she said, voice trembling. "A life that's still yours if you'll take it. But you keep living like you're waiting to die." Her words hit harder than any bullet. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, but she wasn't. He set down his cup, the steam rising between them like smoke. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything." She leaned forward, eyes burning. "Don't I?" Silence filled the room. And in that silence, something shifted. He rose slowly, crossing the small space between them. His hand hovered for a moment, then found her shoulder. "I ain't good with words," he said, voice low. "But I see you, Maggie. You've done more for this place than anyone had a right to, more than I deserved." Her breath hitched. "And what do you want to do with that, Luke?" He didn't answer, not with words. Outside, the morning light grew bright, spilling through the window onto the cradle. The baby stirred, fussed, then went quiet again. Luke looked down at him, then back at her. "Maybe it's time to stop looking back," he said. "Maybe it's time we build something worth keeping." She hesitated, then nodded, slow, eyes shining. But peace on the frontier never lasted long. A week later, the sheriff rode in with bad news. "Those men you shot," he said grimly, "weren't drifters. They were part of the McCready gang. You can bet their kin come looking." Luke felt the chill run through him. Let him come. But that night, when the moon rose full and white over the plains, he couldn't sleep. He stood at the window, watching the land stretch into darkness. Every shadow a threat. He knew what was coming. Out here, vengeance always found a way. When the first horse whinnied near dawn, he was already dressed, rifle in hand. They came hard and fast. 5 riders, dark against the horizon. Maggie woke to the sound of gunfire and the baby's cry. Luke was already at the door, firing into the pale morning. She ran to the window, saw the riders circling. He shouted, "Get Eli and stay low." But she didn't hide. Not this time. She loaded a spare revolver, her hand shaking, but steady enough to fire through the kitchen window. One man went down. Luke turned, startled and proud. The fight was brutal and short. The McCready gang wasn't ready for a man with nothing left to lose and a woman who'd already saved his life once. When the dust cleared, 3 men lay dead. 2 fled into the hills. Luke staggered back into the house, bleeding from a graze along his arm. Maggie caught him before he fell. "You fool," she whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. He smiled weakly. "Told you storms pass." She pressed a cloth to his wound, her voice breaking. "And some don't." He reached up, his hand finding hers. This one did. The baby cried again, strong and alive. Luke turned toward the sound, eyes wet with more than pain. "That boy's got his mother's fire," he murmured. "And maybe yours too." Maggie looked at him, the truth finally settling between them, not as a question, but as something they both already knew. Weeks later, when spring came at last, the land bloomed again. The graves by the north fence grew wildflowers, and laughter returned to the Carter Ranch for the first time in months. Luke still carried his scars, but they no longer felt like chains. One evening, As the sun dipped low, he stood on the porch with Maggie beside him, Eli sleeping in her arms. The world stretched wide and endless before them. "Funny," Luke said quietly, "how a man can lose everything and still find more than he ever thought he'd have." She smiled. "Maybe that's the way of it out here. You lose, you fight, you keep going. That's living." He nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "That's home." And as the wind whispered to the tall grass, carrying the scent of rain and rebirth, the widowed rancher finally found peace. Not in forgetting the past, but in building a new one with a girl who'd once knocked on his door with courage in her heart and life in her hands. Because out there on the frontier, where death was a daily companion, sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected place. A neighbor girl, a newborn's cry, and the strength to start again.